You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 312 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. When we talk about slavery and the slave trade, we often tend to focus on the transatlantic or international slave trade. And this is because, within the context of this podcast, that was the slave trade that dominated in North America during the 17th and 18th centuries. But by 1808, a different slave trade came to dominate in the young United States, and this was the domestic or internal slave trade. Joshua Rothman, an award-winning historian, professor, and author of the book, The Ledger and the Chain, How Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America, leads us on an exploration of the United States' domestic slave trade and of the lives of three slave traders who really helped to define this trade. Now, during our exploration, Josh reveals the long history of North America's domestic or internal slave trade, how and why the United States Congress passed a ban on the international or transatlantic slave trade in 1808, and how the 1808 ban on the international slave trade allowed the domestic slave trade to grow, develop, and emerge as a profitable business in the 19th century. But first, if you enjoy this podcast, you may like to know that Ben Franklin's World has a swag shop. It's an online store where you can purchase Ben Franklin's World t-shirts, tote bags, hoodies, and so much more. And it's also a place where each purchase helps support this podcast. You can visit the swag shop at benfranklinsworld.com/shop. That's benfranklinsworld.com/shop. Are you ready to investigate and explore the history and business of the United States' domestic slave trade? Let's go meet our guest historian. Joining us is an award-winning historian who is a professor of history at the University of Alabama and the co-director of Freedom on the Move, a database of fugitives from North American slavery. He's the author of numerous books, including his most recent book, The Ledger and the Chain, How Domestic Slave Traders Shaped America. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Joshua Rothman.
Thank you, Liz. It's good to be here.
Josh, we know from our study of early America that the slave trade is something that keeps coming up all the time in episodes of this podcast and in the books that we like to read or the documentaries we like to watch. And I think many of us, when we think about slavery in the early American context, when we think of the slave trade, we're thinking of that transatlantic slave trade with the Caribbean and Africa. But in The Ledger and the Chain, your new book, you talk about a different slave trade, the domestic slave trade. So could we start with having you give us an overview of the domestic slave trade?
Sure. In the colonial period and even into the early republic, there obviously is a transatlantic trade. There's an extensive trade in enslaved people among the American mainland colonies and into the Caribbean. But simultaneously, there's also an internal slave trade, a trade in enslaved people within individual colonies across colonial lines. And that becomes much more extensive in the 19th century. Once the transatlantic slave trade is legally closed in 1808, the domestic slave trade, the trade in enslaved people within the boundaries of the United States, takes off dramatically.
So the domestic slave trade had a really early start. It was taking place before the states were states. It was taking place when they were still colonies.
Oh, sure. Yeah. I mean, as soon as there are enslaved people in North America, there is a trade in enslaved people within North America. It's a form of chattel slavery, and so enslaved people become commodities. So whenever there's a need for an exchange of labor, an exchange of enslaved people as assets, enslaved people can be used as barter, they can be mortgaged, et cetera, et cetera. There's a trade to be had, and it goes on really from the 17th century forward.
Much of our conversation will take place in the 19th century and focus on the domestic slave trade that formed and matured during the 1800s. But Josh, I'm curious, in this earlier period, during the colonial and revolutionary periods, if you were a slaveholder, What did you need to participate in this domestic slave trade? How did you even decide, where you were going to purchase an enslaved person and how you were going to sell an enslaved person?
Yeah, so it's a little more complicated in that period because there really aren't what we would call professional slave traders. They're really very few and far between. What you imagine in the 19th century of people putting advertisements in the newspaper saying they want to buy and sell enslaved people, that they are in the market for that, that this is their job, this is their profession, that there's an industry that does this. That really doesn't exist in the 17th and the 18th century. And so the trade then is going to be a lot more informal. It's going to happen more by word of mouth, and it's going to happen more locally in the same way that most markets happen more locally.
One of the really big pivotal moments, it seems, in the domestic slave trade is in 1808. This is the date when Congress passes a law to ban the legal importation of enslaved people from outside of the United States. Josh, could you tell us why Congress passed this ban on the international slave trade in 1808 and what impact this ban had on Americans' ability to buy and sell enslaved people?
The ban that's passed in 1808 was something that pretty much everyone knew was coming. It's embedded in the Constitution that Congress could not do anything about the importation of enslaved people for 20 years after ratification. So that meant that 1808 is really the first date that a ban could be passed. Now, by the time the Constitution is ratified, most states had already either limited or abolished participation in the transatlantic trade. Really, the only states that are still heavily involved in it are South Carolina and Georgia, I think to a lesser extent, North Carolina as well. By 1808, the territory of Louisiana is participating in the transatlantic trade, but that's pretty much it by 1808. And the reason that Congress gets involved with this, part of it is a moral objection. By the late 18th century, the ambivalence about slavery and really a kind of moral hostility to the slave trade had started to grow among a significant number of white people in the early United States. That has nothing to do with slavery itself. They believed they could draw a kind of moral distinction between slavery as it existed and the idea that you were somehow sort of kidnapping people from abroad and bringing them overseas. And so some of it is a moral objection, and some of it is simply economic calculation on the part of many large slaveholding states that already existed. So a state like Virginia, for example, which has the largest enslaved population in the United States, policymakers in Virginia and slaveholders in Virginia understood that if enslaved people could no longer be supplied from abroad, then the value of the enslaved people within the United States would automatically go up. They would have effectively a closed market. And so there's an incentive for them to see the transatlantic trade brought to an end. So it's this weird combination of economic calculus and moral consideration that leads Congress to put the ban in place that everybody kind of knew they were going to already. But what that does is it effectively means that if any slaveholders or prospective slaveholders within the United States wanted enslaved laborers, the only place they could get them legally was within the boundaries of the United States itself. And Congress does nothing to limit that market. And so effectively what the ban in 1808 does is it creates a sanctioned market, a federally protected sanctioned market for enslaved people within the boundaries of the United States. So at the same time that the transatlantic trade is legally closed, that same ban is a sort of jet fuel for the domestic trade.
You said that many in the United States were anticipating this ban on the international or transatlantic slave trade in 1808, but it still seems pretty amazing to me that Congress is able to get this ban passed in 1808, because if you look at United States history writ large and you look at the history of slavery within it, anytime Congress took up debates about slavery and limiting it in any capacity, well, you would have found very little bipartisan support for that kind of limitation or ban.
Yeah, and the truth is that had the Constitution been written 20 years later, right, had the initial document been drafted in 1808 instead of 1787, and I don't really like to play these sort of speculative history games, but if we're going to do it, let's do it. Had it been written a generation later, I think the calculus would have been a lot different and it would have been a lot more contested because by that point you have the Louisiana Territory is acquired, expansion into the West is happening, the Cotton Revolution has begun. And so the value of enslaved people and the value of slavery to the United States has changed significantly from what it was a generation before. So in some ways, it's a peculiar moment, and it really is just a moment in the early republic when this kind of ban could have been put into place. Had the time frame been different, it's not clear to me that it would have happened at all.
So as Josh stated, with this 1808 congressional ban on the international slave trade, the United States effectively created a federally protected domestic slave trade. And in his book, The Ledger and the Chain, Josh follows the lives of 3 slave traders who participated in this federally protected trade in the United States: Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard. Josh, would you tell us about these 3 men, how they became involved with the domestic slave trade, and why you chose to center your book, The Ledger and the Chain, on these 3 men's lives?
Sure. So it's easier to kind of start with the last part first. Isaac Franklin and John Armfield, when they get together, they create a slave trading company known popularly as Franklin and Armfield. And Franklin and Armfield, if you read about the domestic slave trade, they're everywhere. You really can't read about the domestic slave trade without coming across this company. And that's true because they are probably the largest slave trading company in American history. They certainly were the largest for their time, which was really the late 1820s and into most of the 1830s. And I wanted to write about them because even though there's been a lot of work done in recent years on the domestic slave trade, and for a long time there really wasn't, but starting probably in the late 90s and then for the last 20 years or so, there's a pretty extensive historiography that's been developed. We still knew very little about slave traders themselves, where they came from, who they were, why they did what they did, kind of detailed examinations of their operations and how that worked. And it seemed to me that it was a hole in the historiography that I thought was important to fill. And if you're going to do that, if you're going to look at slave traders, Franklin and Armfield are clearly the ones who stand out as the giants to take a look at. In terms of who they are and where they come from, how they get involved in the trade, Isaac Franklin is first. He's the oldest of the 3. He is from a family of sort of frontier settlers in Middle Tennessee. His father had gotten to Tennessee as a long hunter, so he's one of these very early men who's kind of sort of trespassing on native land, speculating, trying to sort of imagine how he's going to make his fortune on this property. And Isaac Franklin gets involved in the slave trade with his older brothers in the first decade of the 19th century. They are basically going over the mountains, bringing people back from the Chesapeake into Tennessee, bringing them to the rivers, down the Mississippi to places like Natchez and New Orleans. And his brothers sort of get out of the trade after the War of 1812, but Franklin really liked the business. He was good at it. He could make a lot of money at it, and he wanted to stay at it. So Franklin is really a slave trader starting in the early 19th century, and he stays in the business for about 30 years. John Armfield gets involved a little bit later than that. He's younger than Franklin. He was someone who comes out of a family from central North Carolina, sort of small to middling sized farming family. His father was a small slaveholder, but John Armfield never wanted to be a farmer. It's a really sort of peculiarity about him. He grew up in a farming family. He understands how that works. He did farm labor as a young man, but it's very clear that he has no interest in doing that for a living. The moment he turns 18, basically, he's like, I got to get out of here. And he goes and he opens a mercantile business a couple of counties away. He runs that for a few years reasonably successfully. He stops doing it for reasons that I detail in the book. And he's sort of looking for something else to do. And he meets Isaac Franklin in 1824. They get to talking. It's clear that Franklin sort of encourages him, hey, if you're looking for a business to get involved in, you know how accounts work, you know how to buy and sell things, you might want to consider this business. And so Armfield takes that under advisement and gets involved in the business. He starts trading in enslaved people probably about 1825, and then reconnects with Franklin a few years later, and they start Franklin and Armfield in 1828. Now, Rice Ballard is really the kind of third partner. he's not a silent partner, but his name is not in the title of the company. He's brought on in 1831, so a few years after they started the business. And he's sort of part of a move to expand into new markets. He becomes the company agent in Richmond and then eventually becomes a formal partner in the company. And he actually had been involved in the slave trade probably a few years before John Armfield. He is also from a kind of small farming family in central Virginia. He's from basically near what's now Fredericksburg. And he was someone who, as a young man, basically gets recruited into the slave trade by a mentor who had identified him as somebody who he thought would be good at the business, a man named Samuel Alsop, who's extremely wealthy. He's the richest man in the county, a very large slaveholder. He's also an architect, a builder, a tavern keeper, and he's someone who just has a lot of money sitting around and he's looking to put it to use. And so he decides he's going to put it to use in the slave trade. He sees that it's growing and getting more profitable in the 1820s, but he's too old to do it himself. He has a son who's too young to get into the slave trade, but Alsop knows Rice Ballard's family. There are various connections between Alsop's family and Ballard's family, and one way or another, Alsop comes to Ballard when he's about 20, 21 years old and says, hey, if I front the money, is this a business that you'd be willing to run for me? We'll go into business together. You do the work, I'll put up the money. And Ballard says, okay, let's do it. And so Ballard starts trading in enslaved people, moving them from Virginia down to Natchez, Mississippi. And that's how he and Franklin and Armfield get to know each other, right? Slave traders all working in the same markets. And so that's how they get started, and that's how they come together.
Could you tell us a bit more about the business end of the domestic slave trade? It sounds like Franklin, Armfield, and Ballard partnered because they all had different businesses in different areas of the country and different business skills. So I'm curious about the scope of their partnership and their business and what exactly went into running a slave trade, business operation.
Yeah. So what's interesting about Franklin and Armfield, I think there are a lot of things that are interesting about them, but one thing that's interesting about them from the beginning is that they go very big from the get-go. Franklin and Armfield pool between them probably the equivalent today of what's about $500,000, maybe more. And they start operating across very long distances, that they're an interstate firm. So Armfield is purchasing people in Northern Virginia out of a headquarters in Alexandria, and he is sending them mostly by ship to Isaac Franklin, who is picking them up in New Orleans. He sells some people in New Orleans. He's moving most people by steamboat further up the Mississippi to Natchez. Rice Ballard, as I said, is put into place in Richmond, which is another sort of growing market. And really, from the outset, they are moving dozens of people at a time, eventually hundreds of people at a time. And yeah, they each have particular skills. So Isaac Franklin, because he'd been in the trade for so long, by 1828, he had developed relationships with bankers and merchants and planters in the lower South. And so people, particularly in Natchez, but also in New Orleans, they already knew who he was by the late 1820s. He's perfectly positioned to say, okay, I'm setting up something different here, something really big, and is in a position to have lots of customers flock to him. He's also in a position to create relationships with lots of different banks. So he has access to credit that a lot of other traders wouldn't have. And so both in terms of sales and in terms of getting involved in credit networks, that is really Franklin's skill set. Armfield's skill set is really much more in logistics and shipping. So he is really, really talented at not only identifying enslaved people to purchase, but also in terms of the logistics of moving people by ship. And this is something that not all slave traders did. There were other slave traders before them who sent people by ship. But the image we mostly have in our heads of the domestic slave trade is the coffle system. We see these pictures and drawings and images of enslaved people in chains marched in a line over land. And the truth is that that is the dominant model of the slave trade for the first half of the 19th century. But Armfield, and there were other traders who did this as well, he's loading people into large sailing vessels in Alexandria, and he's sending them by ship down the Atlantic coast, around Florida, up into the Gulf of Mexico. And this was sort of a complicated operation. You've got to have boats in motion at all times. You've got to be keeping track of this. You've got to figure out whether you're renting space on ships. Eventually, they buy ships of their own. and they're bringing back things from the lower South. So they send enslaved people to New Orleans, fill the hold with cotton and sugar and molasses and other items, and bring them back for sale. And so Armfield is really, really talented at that. Ballard has a mix of all of those skills. He doesn't have like one particular thing that he does for the company, and his role actually changes over the course of time. So he's never really someone who's sort of centrally involved in the shipping element of things. I mean, he's putting people on steamboats, sending them down the James River and meeting Armfield ships in Norfolk. So he does know how to do the shipping part of the operation, but he's working in Richmond for a while. Eventually, after Isaac Franklin retires, he moves down to Natchez and takes over the sales part of the operation. He does know about credit networks and banking. And so Ballard is kind of a jack of all trades in the slave trade. He does lots of different things. But what makes the company work really well is that these are men who, as you rightly note, do have slightly different skill sets that complement each other very, very well. And they understood their particular expertise. And so I think that by not stepping on each other's toes a lot, that is part of what makes them successful.
And how successful were they? There's a lot of movement of people and goods going north, south, and even west. How much money did these guys make?
A lot of money. It can be hard to sort of pin down exactly what they're making in any given year. I've been able to figure out kind of rough estimates of what, not necessarily what their profit margins are, but what they're clearing in a given year. And in modern terms, it's in the millions. Now, some of that is in cash that they're bringing in. Some of it is in debt. One of the things that makes them so successful is that a lot of slave traders were only interested in cash sales. This is a business that they're bringing people to New Orleans and they're like, look, I don't want to come back and have to collect debts. I'm interested in cash sale. If you don't have cash, then we can't do business. But there are traders, and Franklin and Armfield are among them, who say, well, look, I'm going to be here. I'm going to come back here every year. And if you don't have the cash now, I'll sell you enslaved people on credit at interest. And Franklin and Armfield are sometimes sitting on hundreds of thousands of dollars in paper, right? Collectible debts. And that can translate to millions and millions of dollars in modern money. By the time they retire from the slave trade, and we have estimates of what their personal fortunes are, if you just directly translate it by inflation, they're worth anywhere from, depending on which man you're talking about, sort of $15 to $25 million. But in some ways, that's not really an accurate assessment of how wealthy they are, because if you try to figure out, okay, well, not just by inflation, but relative to the size of the economy, right? And the modern economy is much, much larger than the economy was in, the 1830s and 1840s. And really relative to the size of the economy at the time, someone like Isaac Franklin, when he dies, is worth the rough equivalent of, between $400 and $450 million in modern money. So they are, they're not the richest men in the country, but they are certainly among the richest men in the South. And they are among what would be, sort of the 1% of their time. They become extremely wealthy men.
Now, one interesting aspect of Josh's book, The Ledger and the Chain, is that Josh really takes the time to describe the space and materiality of the domestic slave trade, not just its business side. In fact, he tells us about places like Franklin and Armfield slave ships, Ballard Slave Jail in Richmond, their slave trading compound in Alexandria, and their showroom at Forks in the Road. Josh, why did you take so much time in The Ledger and the Chain to help us visualize the places of the domestic slave trade? And could you help us visualize one of these places that you talk about in your book?
Sure. I think some of the answer to that is it's simply a narrative strategy. In terms of the storytelling, there are big parts of the book that are about the business of the slave trade, and that material can be dry. They're selling person A to person B, and they're arranging this sort of credit network. And I think it's important to tell that part of the story because it's in some ways what makes the slave trade so horrifying is that it is so mundane. It is so day to day and works like any other business. And I think it's important to tell that part of the story. But in terms of a narrative device of getting the reader to feel and sense not just how it worked in terms of the money and the business, but how does this work in terms of just the physical experience of this? What did this really look like? You need to be able to conjure up sort of the physical spaces. And as you say, the materiality of how this worked. I think it's important for the reader to be able to visualize what these places look like to the extent that we can recreate them. And some places I couldn't recreate. Rice Ballard's jail in Richmond, for example, I know where it was. I know a very little bit about how it worked, but what the actual physical description of it was like, that was something that I had to draw on other narratives, narratives from enslaved people who were in jails in Richmond and said what these places looked like. But a place like John Armfield's headquarters in Alexandria, by contrast, we have pretty extensive descriptions of it. I don't know if readers find this strange or not. I think some readers do find it strange, but Alexandria is at the time part of the District of Columbia. So it is technically part of the nation's capital, and it's right outside of Washington, D.C. And that made it a real target for anti-slavery activists. They are enraged and outraged by the slave trade as it gets bigger and bigger and bigger over time. And the fact that it would exist in a federal district, in a place that Congress controlled and could have done something about, that is something that they find particularly outrageous. And it's something that, if you were an anti-slavery activist, you weren't going to show up in Natchez, Mississippi and start sort of identifying yourself as an abolitionist, say, hey, can I have a look around? That could be sort of a problem. But going to someplace like Alexandria, Virginia, all you had to do was, you could walk if you wanted to from Washington City itself. It's 5 or 6 miles away. You could walk there if you wanted to. You could get on a steamboat and be there in an hour. And so they would go and they would basically sort of knock on the door of the facility, and John Armfield would open the door, and they made no pretenses about who they were. They were abolitionists who wanted to see how the slave trade worked. And John Armfield, strangely enough, would say, sure, come on in. I'll show you around. I'll have one of my guys give you a tour. And they would. And so you have these narratives of, some are very extensive, some are a little bit briefer, but that describe the interior of the offices of Franklin and Armfield, of the sort of slave pen and jail out in the back where they would keep enslaved people until they were ready to be sold. And they provided very detailed descriptions of what the place looked like. And I thought it was important to really kind of get that across for the reader. I think it helps explain how the business worked. I think it also helps explain, to a certain extent, what the subjective experience of enslaved people was like. One thing that I try to do in the book, enslaved people are not the center of the narrative, but I also don't want anyone to read this book and to be able to go into it for very long without remembering, oh, wait, right, there's people on the other side of this. I hope that you can't get more than 10, 15, 20 pages in the book before there's a story of an enslaved person and what they're actually experiencing. And I think having a sense of the physical space tells you not only how Franklin and Armfield ran their business, but also how the people who they are trafficking experience that business.
Yeah, you mentioned earlier that we can really get lost in the business side of this trade. It was an innovative trade, so we can get lost in innovations. There was lots of revenue that we can get captured in. And of course, the logistics of the trade, especially if you're using boats to get people back and forth. But I wonder, since we have talked about the business side, could you tell us, maybe from some of these abolitionist accounts that you have read that came out of touring Armfield's facility, how enslaved people experienced the domestic slave trade? What was this trade like for them?
Yeah, and we don't have to rely on abolitionist accounts for that. Abolitionist accounts are really good for describing what they saw, right? But one thing that I did notice when I was reading the abolitionist accounts, and one thing that I point out in the book, is that, they find the slave trade abhorrent. And some of them also find slave traders abhorrent. There certainly are abolitionists who describe them consistently as man stealers, soul drivers, on and on and on, which they were. But every once in a while, there's a real curiosity, is that, an abolitionist will go and visit John Armfield's compound, and they'll come out of it and they'll say, everything I saw in there was really repulsive, but John Armfield seems like a stand-up guy. And it's hard for us, I think, as modern readers to kind of get our heads around that. But I do think that because John Armfield could be so persuasive as a salesman and a businessman, I think it's much more important if you want to get a sense of the experience of the slave trade to hear it from enslaved people themselves. They did talk about it. They wrote about it. They told stories about it. This was something that was sort of an ever-present specter in the lives of every enslaved person in the United States. They always knew, right? Enslaved people, they're in the market effectively at all times. They always knew they could be sold at a moment's notice. And so the experience of having gone through it is almost universally the most traumatic and horrifying experience of an enslaved person's life. And so what I try to do is I try to track down effectively every instance of an enslaved person who describes the interaction directly with Franklin and Armfield. And there are a handful of those. And where I couldn't get those, I tried to talk about experiences that would have been like those of people who went through Franklin and Armfield. So they're really piecing together what that experience was like. Sometimes it could come from anti-slavery people. So, for example, there's a man named Joshua Levitt, who was a prominent anti-slavery activist who wrote about what it was like to go see the slave pen at Franklin and Armfield. And, he goes through and he kind of takes the tour and he notices enslaved women who clearly had been crying, right? He can see that they've been weeping. There's another enslaved activist, a man named Ethan Andrews, who goes through a few years later through the slave pen. And he's getting the spiel from John Armfield's assistant, right? Who's, giving him the slave trader line of like, oh, we treat people really well. We try not to separate families, on and on and on. And Andrews kind of knows he's being fed a line. But he also notices and describes in his narrative when Armfield's man brings him into the pen, he has enslaved boys and men line up against the wall so Andrews can see them. And this is something that would have been true for customers, right? They want to see the quote unquote merchandise. Every time John Armfield's man kind of looks in a different direction, Ethan Andrews notices there's one enslaved man who's trying to catch his eye. And every time he catches his eye, he's just shaking his head back and forth. Nope, nope. And he's careful, right? He doesn't say anything. And he doesn't want to attract the attention of John Armfield's man, but he wants to signal to Ethan Andrews, what you're being told here is a lie. And so sometimes you get that bit of experience of enslaved people, but it's far richer and far more it really kind of tears at you to read experiences of people like Charles Ball, who vividly describes what it was like when the slave trader showed up at the farm where he and his mother and his siblings lived, and just being torn apart from his mother as like a 5-year-old. I mean, that's what the experience of the slave trade is like. It's being torn apart from your family. It's screaming and wailing and desperate pleading. And it's women on the road who know that they are in constant danger of being raped by a slave trader. It's people who are put into showrooms and shown off as if they were, prized thoroughbreds. That's what the experience of the slave trade is like. And I try to capture that more through the voices of enslaved people themselves where I could find them.
You mentioned that sometimes you read something contradictory, like John Armfield is participating in the domestic slave trade, which is awful, and yet some abolitionists also walk away having interacted with him thinking, well, he's not such a bad guy. Lydia and Stessa have some questions about this. Lydia wonders if slave traders considered their business as a legitimate enterprise and whether they felt proud of the business they conducted. And Stessa would like to know if any slave traders, like John Armfield, left any documentation about regrets, remorses, or even changes of opinion that they might have had about slavery and their own involvement in the slave trade.
So the first thing I'd say is that slave traders in the United States didn't need to try to consider their business a legitimate business. Their business was a legitimate business. There's nothing illegal about what they do. Now, there are slave traders who do illegal things, for sure, but domestic slave trade in the United States is a legal business. It is something that is sanctioned by the federal government, right? It is interstate commerce. If the federal government wanted to do something about it, they could have. They chose not to. Individual states do sometimes try to limit the slave trade for various reasons, but bans and restrictions on it and even regulations on it rarely last for very long. So slave traders don't need to wonder, is their business a legitimate business? Their business is a legitimate business in the United States, and that's part of what's so horrifying about it. In terms of whether they're proud of it, I think, look, people like John Armfield and Isaac Franklin, there was really nothing that would have made them feel particularly ashamed about it. They have regular office buildings with like a sign over the door saying plainly what they're doing. Obviously, anti-slavery activists are appalled by what they do. There are white Southerners who say that they find the slave trade horrifying and immoral, and they don't want to do business with slave traders. I mean, that doesn't really change the reality of what they do in real life. What they say and what they do are two different things. And yeah, I think Franklin and Armfield and most slave traders who were successful were quite proud of what they did. They are entrepreneurs in the first half of the 19th century in the United States. Being an entrepreneur in the slave trade business was a perfectly acceptable way to do business. It's not something that's acceptable to everyone. There's always an undercurrent of opposition and hostility and moral ambivalence, sometimes moral outrage, but that undercurrent is overwhelmed by the sheer size and scope and scale of the business. And Franklin and Armfield are quite proud of what they build, and they never for a moment express remorse. There's not a second, not a bit of surviving evidence that suggests they felt badly about what they did, wondered whether maybe I shouldn't do this anymore. Never. I think that from what we do know about slave traders, there are people who, every once in a while, there are slave traders who think that the slave trade is going to be a good business to get into, and then they get into it and find maybe they don't have the stomach for it. But overwhelmingly, that is simply not the case. If it was, you wouldn't have a slave trade that carried on for so long and that was so extensive. Most men who get into the slave trade are men who decide that this was a good way to make money. They have no moral qualms about doing it, and they're going to do it for as long as they feel like they need to and want to.
Our conversation thus far has really been about white men who worked as slave traders. And Susan wonders if the slave trade was an occupation that women could participate in. So Josh, we need to take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. And then we'd really like to hear more about women and their involvement in the domestic slave trade. Benjamin Franklin often used his Poor Richard's Almanac to provide useful advice to his readers, including advice about money. Within the pages of his almanac, Franklin was known to share maxims, these pithy statements like, "A penny saved is a penny earned. An investment in knowledge always pays the best interest. And rather go to bed without dinner than to rise in debt." So given Franklin's interest in money, savings, and debt, it's really quite fitting that today's episode sponsor is Lightstream, a division of SunTrust Bank. Lightstream allows you to be smart and pay off your credit card balances with a credit card consolidation loan from Lightstream. You can get a loan from Lightstream from $5,000 to $100,000 with absolutely no fees. Rates start at 4.98% APR with autopay and excellent credit, and you can even get access to your loan as soon as the day you apply. Now, just for my listeners, apply now to get a special interest rate discount and save even more. The only way to get this discount is to go to lightstream.com/BFW. That's lightstream.com/BFW. Loans from Lightstream are subject to credit approval. Rates range from 4.98% APR to 19.99% APR and include a 0.5% autopay discount. Lowest rate requires excellent credit. Terms and conditions apply, and offers are subject to change without notice. Visit lightstream.com/BFW for more details and information.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Eastman of Virginia Commonwealth University, and my newest book, The Strange Genius of Mr. O, The World of the United States' First Forgotten Celebrity, is out now. During the early 19th century, James Ogilvy was the very face of eloquence. He had been a burned-out immigrant schoolteacher who discovered that he had a real knack for the spoken word, delivering thoughtful and passionate speeches. And in 1808, he decided to abandon the schoolroom and undertake a career as a traveling public speaker. The reason why Ogilvy matters so much to the history of early America is that he was, in essence, the first great public speaker who vast numbers of early Americans were able to see. He was somebody who was terribly eager, not just to make a name for himself, but also to help Americans imagine a kind of, maybe not unity, but at least he could get them unified in thinking together about the same subjects. And he succeeded. One of the most remarkable things about his story is how long he succeeded in doing exactly that. Be sure to pick up your copy of The Strange Genius of Mr. O wherever you buy your books.
And if you'd like to purchase your copy of The Strange Genius of Mr. O at a 40% discount, visit benfranklinsworld.com/Mr. O and use promo code 01BFW. That's benfranklinsworld.com/Mr. O and use promo code 01BFW. Josh, could women work as slave traders? Did they play a role in the domestic slave trade?
So it's very rare. And I'm not sure I've actually seen any instances of women who are regular, ongoing, professional slave traders the way that Franklin and Armfield were. In the same way that you don't generally see white women running independent businesses in any sector of the economy in pre-Civil War America. That was not something women generally did. However, white women are extensively involved in the slave trade. Easily the best work on this in recent years is Stephanie Jones Rogers' book, which is about white women as slaveholders in the United States. And she describes accurately and fairly extensively that female slaveholders, first of all, that there are far more of them than we imagine, that they understood very well the value of their enslaved property, that they engage extensively in the slave market in buying and selling enslaved people. I know from Franklin and Armfield sales records, the ones that we can recover in New Orleans, that white women are sometimes customers who are buying enslaved people from them. And so, yeah, white women are not necessarily professional slave traders, but they are extensively involved in the slave market and I have a fairly savvy understanding of enslaved property. We do also know that there are occasionally white women who are involved in the illegal slave trade. You know, I think of Rick Bell's book about kidnapping, and he describes one of the most famous kidnapping rings anywhere in the United States. And the woman who's sort of in charge is a woman named Patsy Cannon. And she is working out of Maryland, and she has a number of people who are working with her, and she's a kidnapper. That's how she makes her money. And that's not legal, obviously, but it's certainly kidnapping is also a part of the slave trade and helps make it work. So, yeah, I mean, there absolutely are white women who are slave holders, who are involved in the slave trade. I think arguably you could make a case that to a certain extent, every slaveholder is a slave trader at some point or another, maybe not professionally, but they are trading in enslaved people. And so, yeah, there are certainly white women who were part of this larger business operation.
So how did the slave trade end in the United States? We started our conversation talking about how the domestic slave trade began in the 17th century and really developed and professionalized in the 19th century. But what about its end? When did the United States decide to end the slave trade?
The United States doesn't decide to end the trade. It ends when slavery ends. That's the answer. You know, anti-slavery activists really rail against the slave trade, right? Of all the things that they sort of brought to bear of their critique of slavery, the slave trade is really central to that critique because it is so visceral. The auction block, the tearing apart of mothers and children, right? It's not only useful because it is objectively so horrifying, but it is also effective propaganda. I mean, if you're going to sort of try to get white Northerners to be on your side, they might buy some of the pro-slavery propaganda that says, well, you know, they're just on farms and they're not treated that badly. I mean, this is what pro-slavery people said, right? And maybe they're not bought and sold as much as maybe we think they are. Anti-slavery activists knew different, and they wanted to persuade people of that. But even though that is effective in getting people to become sympathetic to the anti-slavery cause, if you actually wanted to say, okay, well, before the Civil War, what limitations are actually placed on the slave trade? Like, how successful were anti-slavery activists at building actual policy changes? The answer is almost zero. Almost zero. The slave trade is banned in Washington, D.C. as a consequence of the Compromise of 1850. That's basically it. There are no other limitations on the interstate slave trade until the Civil War. And that's effectively when the slave trade ends. And the slave trade lasts until the very, very end of the Civil War. I mean, you would think that as slavery collapses during the war and as Confederate currency becomes basically worthless over the course of the war, you would think that white Southerners would say to themselves, you know, I don't think slavery is going to make it. I don't think investing in enslaved people is really the way to go. Like, that's not the future. And you would think that slave traders would say, well, I mean, Confederate currency, really? I mean, is that really what I want to sell enslaved people for? Like, is that really going to be worth anything down the line? And yet, the slave trade carries on all through the war, right to the very, very end. When the United States Army liberates Richmond in April 1865, there's this famous incident where they have to chase down a slave trader. There's a slave trader who has a jail in Richmond. The Union Army comes in, the city's burning to the ground, and this guy has decided that he's going to put the last couple dozen people who he has held captive in chains and try to march them out of the city. He's like, maybe I can sell them someplace else. Like, the delusions of this are sort of jaw-dropping, but that's how committed and how embedded the slave trade is to what makes slavery work, that it lasts to the very, very end.
Did Franklin, Armfield, or Ballard live to see the end of the slave trade?
Armfield is. Isaac Franklin dies in 1846. He's in his sort of mid to late 50s. Rice Ballard dies in 1860. So he dies really just a few months before the election of 1860. So neither one of them saw all of this fall apart. And in fact, Rice Ballard, in his will, when he leaves all his land and the people he enslaves to his wife and his daughters, he puts in his will that he wants his executor to invest any money that gets made in land and slaves. He's like, this is going to be it. I've made my money in this. My family's going to make their money in this. So he wants to keep going. John Armfield survives the war. He makes it to 1871 before he dies, and he sees everything come crumbling down around him. And I don't think it says very much to say that he had it coming. He is somebody who, when the Civil War comes, he's all in on the Confederacy. He's very pro-Confederate. He pays to outfit a company of Confederate soldiers in Tennessee. And very, very quickly, by about the first year or so of the war, he tells one of his, sort of a guy who works for him, he says, this is the biggest shipwreck I ever saw. He realizes this is just a disaster. And he loses almost everything. All the money that he had is almost all completely wiped out by the Civil War. But yeah, he's the only one who survives to see the end of it.
Before we jump into the time warp, Chris is curious about whether there's any residue or legacy in American society left over from the domestic slave trade. So we've really talked about how the trade was a business and an innovative business. Is there any legacy to the slave trade that we can still see in American society and possibly even in American business today?
So that's an interesting question. I think in terms of sort of direct business innovations, I don't think the slave trade is uniquely responsible for a lot of the things that business-wise may have outlasted slavery in the Civil War. I mean, I think a scholar like Caitlin Rosenthal, for example, writes in her book Accounting for Slavery and talks about how there were some modern business and management methods that you did see implemented with slavery and the slave trade. You know, and she doesn't try to tell it as an origin story, but she's like, look, slavery is pretty important to embedding these things in the way American capitalism works. The slave trade is extensively involved in early railroads and the early telegraph. As that gets off the ground, the slave trade and slave traders participate in that and help sort of propel those technologies forward. But obviously, the slave trade isn't unique in that regard. There's lots of businesses that get involved in that way. Sort of integrating human commodities, enslaved people as chattel with credit networks and money markets is something that the slave trade does. And obviously, once enslaved people are no longer assets, they're no longer considered property. That's something that doesn't outlast the trade. So there are business innovations that slavery broadly is involved in, that the slave trade is involved in, that continue on well past slavery's end and do contribute to the evolution of American capitalism. But I think the slave trade's legacy, it plays out in multiple ways. Look, some of it's the money, right? Even though enslaved people are no longer property after 1865, everything that has been spun off from the time that they were property, that doesn't disappear. All the times that enslaved people were bought and sold and mortgaged, the profits that are made from that, the banks that are underpinned by the bodies of enslaved people that serve as the collateral underpinning the bonds of these banks, the cotton they produce, the sugar they produce, and on and on and on, all the labor that's put into the American economy by slavery and enslaved people, anything that's spun off from that, people who made the profit from that, they keep that. They don't give it back. And that money continues to circulate, right? So everything that slavery had produced over the course of its existence continues to go on throughout the United States, and it continues to exist to this day because the money is everywhere. People ask me sometimes, okay, well, where's the money from Franklin and Armfield? The answer is the money's everywhere. It's all around us. So some of the legacy I think we see is that. Some of the legacy I think is sort of more intangible than that. I think there are people who would draw direct connections between the slave trade and things like mass incarceration, things like the racial wealth gap in the United States. And I do think there are ways in which there are clearly connections between those things. I'm not someone who says there's sort of a direct line. I don't think that you can just go, the slave trade becomes convict leasing, becomes mass incarceration. There is a line there, but it's more complicated than that. But what I would say is that one thing that the slave trade does, and that I think lingers in American society for a very long time and arguably still does, is that the slave trade and slavery itself, it accustoms white Americans to think of Black people as suitable for being put in chains, for being put in prisons. Like when you conjured up the image of Black people in the United States, that's what it was. They were enslaved. They were put in chains. They were bought and sold in markets. And once that image is sort of implanted in people's minds, it doesn't just vanish in 1865. It continues on, and it makes it easier for things like convict leasing to be carried out. Like if that's what you imagine is an appropriate position for Black people in this country, then it continues on and it enables the kind of institutional racism. It enables the institution of mass incarceration. That's part of what makes those things tick. And I think the slave trade is directly implicated and bears a disproportionate part of the responsibility for carrying that sort of image forward.
Now, Josh, I know you said earlier in our conversation that you don't like to play hypotheticals, but we're going to jump into the time warp nonetheless. So this is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently. So Josh, in your opinion, what might have happened if Congress had not banned the importation of enslaved Africans in 1808? How might the trajectory of the 19th century domestic slave trade have been different?
That's a really interesting question. So I think a lot of things would have been different. First, I think it's possible to imagine that states in the Deep South in particular would have tried to continue importing people from overseas much more than they did, right? There is an illegal slave trade that carries on. There are people still imported from overseas, from Africa, from the Caribbean. We know that this carries on illegally until the Civil War. There's a book out by John Harris that details this. And there's several books about the illegal slave trade, but John Harris has a recent book about it. Details extensive connections among men in the South and in New York and Cuba that's talking about the importation of people illegally. So it's not hard to imagine that had it been legal, it would have been even larger than it was. But I think we also need to remember that Great Britain had committed itself to cracking down on the transatlantic trade. And so the British Navy is out there trying to keep this trade from getting even bigger than it was. And so had Congress not banned the transatlantic trade, some of that impact would have been seen in the way that slavery functioned. And I think it would have changed sort of the demographic makeup of the African American population in the United States. That certainly would have been altered significantly. It would have changed the way that slave markets functioned in the United States. I think the domestic trade still would have been a significant component of the way the American economy worked. The United States would have been effectively an outlaw nation had Congress not banned it. In the eyes of Western Europe, which was, look, as a naval power, Great Britain is no slouch in the 19th century. And so, it would have put the United States really on the wrong side of international law in some ways, to the extent that international law existed. So I think in some ways things would have been very different. And in some ways things wouldn't have been that different at all. And look, I think we could also flip that question on its head and say, okay, well, what if Congress had the courage, the political will, and the political ability to say that interstate commerce in enslaved people was illegal? They could have done that, theoretically. Like, it's not ambiguous. It's right there in the Constitution. You don't have to read into it. Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. What if they had done that? Then I think you would see things that were very different. First of all, you would have seen a lot of crime because bringing people across state lines would have happened anyway. There would have been enormous criminality. Basically, it would have been illegal human trafficking instead of legal human trafficking. But had that been in place and had it been effectively enforced, which is very challenging and maybe would have been undoable, slavery could not have possibly grown the way that it did. I mean, one thing about the slave trade is that it's not just that it's vital to making the American economy grow. If you don't have the ability to move laborers around and to get laborers from point A, where they might be less useful, to point B, where you really, really need them, the kind of production that enslavers wanted to get out of the cotton economy, the sugar economy, out of enslaved people, it becomes impossible. If you don't have a slave trade, slavery cannot survive to the extent that it does. And so, there's lots of hypotheticals where the slave trade could have been contained, could have grown. There are lots of things that could have happened to alter the trajectory of this.
Now, Josh, you've been working on the ledger and the chain for many years. Do you have a new research project? Have you found one yet?
I find myself in a sort of peculiar spot at the moment. With my first books and with every book I've written, I always sort of knew by the time I was done what I wanted to do next. This one is a little bit different. I have a small project that I'm working on. It's sort of a document project about an early anti-slavery activist. It was something I came across in the course of doing my research and thought it would be really good to maybe kind of clean slave traders out of my system. As you might imagine, doing this kind of research, it's psychologically pretty difficult, even for someone like me who, I've been working on slavery for a couple decades at this point. But this was a really hard book, and it took me to some places I didn't really want to spend time with anymore. And in some ways, that is sort of the challenge of what I want to do next. Because having written 3 books about slavery, do I want to keep working on slavery? And if I do, what elements of slavery do I want to work on? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that yet. So I'm toying with a couple of ideas. I'm interested in some ways in the sort of the place where Reconstruction and the Gilded Age kind of interface in the sort of the first kind of 5 years of the 1870s, where Reconstruction seems like it's something the federal government is not really going to put its muscle behind forever. And that's happening at the exact same time that what becomes the Gilded Age is starting to develop, right? So you've got Reconstruction going into decline, but also massive kind of financial scandals breaking out at the same time. You have the Panic of 1873. And I'm interested in kind of the connections between that kind of juncture in American history, right? I mean, 1873 is the year when Mark Twain writes The Gilded Age. That's what gives that era its name. I'm making my way through that book. I've read a fair amount of Twain, but I've never read The Gilded Age. Everybody says, it's not sort of Twain's best novel, and it's not. But he touches on all sorts of things that are going on that I think it might be an interesting way in to that moment. I don't know if that's what I'm going to write about, but that's sort of what I'm playing around with it now. And I need to figure out sort of what the story is there that I might want to tell. And maybe I'll go in a completely different direction. But if I had to say, okay, what do I think I'm going to work on? I think that's where I'm going, but I'm not sure yet.
And how can we get in contact with you? If we have more questions about slavery and the domestic slave trade, where's the best place to reach you?
Email is probably best. You can find me at the University of Alabama at jrothman@ua.edu. You can direct message me on Twitter. My Twitter DMs are open if somebody wants to message me out of the blue. Those are probably the two best ways. If anybody has any questions, I'm certainly happy to answer them.
Joshua Rothman, thank you for spending time with us today and for helping us better understand the history and development of the domestic slave trade.
Thank you, Liz. I really appreciate it. I like the conversation.
The domestic slave trade once stood as an important part of the early American economy. The business of buying enslaved people and moving them around the United States to places where labor demands made the sale of enslaved people profitable proved to be a big business during the early American Republic. As Josh related, the business partnership of Isaac Franklin, John Armfield, and Rice Ballard stood out and helped to define the domestic slave trade. The way these partners efficiently moved enslaved people from areas of the Upper South to labor-hungry areas of the Lower South and West, and the way that they made use of credit networks to expand the pool of available buyers, stood as a model for other slave traders and slave trading firms to follow and develop their own businesses. Now, the slave trade was a morally repugnant business, but it was a federally sanctioned one until the end of slavery in 1865. It was also a business that generated a lot of money for the early American economy. Money that, as Josh reminds us, still exists and circulates in our economy today. Now, when slavery ended with the end of the Civil War, slave traders and those who made money from both the labor of enslaved people and from the business of trading in their bodies never gave that money back. They didn't use that money to make reparations to the formerly enslaved. Instead, they kept that money and used it to invest in new opportunities and new businesses. Money from the slave trade underpinned new avenues of wealth for those who had it. As Josh noted, this money, along with the way that slavery and the slave trade accustomed white people to view black people as being suitable to be placed in chains or incarcerated in cells, are just two of the legacies of slavery that we're still grappling with today. Which is why investigating the history of slavery and the slave trade is really important work. Knowing more about how and why slavery came to exist and function in the United States, and how slavery created opportunities for business and wealth generation, provides context that we need so that we can better grapple with our present and with the issues that we face in our present day. Look for more information about Josh, his book, The Ledger and the Chain, plus notes and links for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/312. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoy Ben Franklin's World, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team. Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Martha Howard, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, over the years, we've explored a lot of different aspects of slavery and business in the early American Republic. Is there something else that you'd like to explore? Are there any areas of slavery or early American businesses that you'd like us to investigate in a future episode? Let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.